Welcome. If you're one of the millions who were captivated by the sweep of Westeros, who followed the warring families and that looming winter, then you really understand the immense cultural weight of Game of Thrones.
It absolutely became a global cultural engine. It wasn't just appointment television for 8 seasons.
No, not at all.
And that's why today we're intentionally moving past the specific plots. We're not talking about who lived or died or the final narrative choices.
Right. Our focus is squarely on the phenomenon itself. We want to look at the staggering production history, the economic ripple effects, and, the critical conversations that it started.
It really redefined what prestige fantasy television could even be.
So our mission today is to truly understand how this behemoth was built and what it left behind. We're talking about an adaptation of George R. R. Martin's A Song of Ice and Fire novels.
73 episodes on HBO from 2011 to 2019. And it didn't just achieve record viewership.
It fundamentally changed how networks approached big-budget genre storytelling. It cemented its place as one of the greatest and I think most debated TV series of all time.
To really appreciate that scope, we have to start at the very beginning with the author's intention. Because the philosophical foundation of Game of Thrones is, well, it's rooted in a deliberate rejection of traditional fantasy.
When Martin first conceived of these novels, he wasn't interested in the kind of fantasy stories that were popular at the time. Stories where magic was everywhere and morality was black and white.
No, his stated goal was to make his story feel much more like historical fiction than contemporary fantasy.
And that one decision changed everything.
It did. The source material puts less emphasis on overt magic or sorcery. I mean, it's there, but it's often subtle or expensive or very far away. Instead, the focus is on this relentless political maneuvering, devastating battles, and deep character psychology.
Martin felt that the constant reliance on magic, it often diluted the real stakes of a story. He wanted the danger to be human.
And that's what created that famous quote that really sums up his worldview for Westeros. The true horrors of human history derive not from orcs and dark lords, but from ourselves.
That statement is just a radical reframing of the fantasy genre.
Absolutely. The result is a story so steeped in the grim reality of power struggles that academics have actually classified the show as neo-medieval.
What does that term mean, exactly?
It reflects its focus on overlapping authentic medieval history with, popular fantasy tropes. It's a medieval world where the fantastical elements exist on the fringes, not at the center.
The political leaders aren't shining knights. They're ruthless pragmatists. We see this rejection of traditional good versus evil all through the narrative.
Martin argued that this common theme of clear moral polarity, it just doesn't reflect the complexity of the real world. A world where leaders are usually driven by selfish ambition, dynasty, and a profound disregard for the average person.
The series excels at presenting characters who operate in these shades of gray. You might initially root for someone, but their methods are, they're invariably questionable.
Even the few characters who seem to carry a mantle of inherent morality, like Daenerys Targaryen, Jon Snow, or Tyrion Lannister, they still have their methods and their commitment to altruism constantly scrutinized.
They make terrible choices, not because some dark lord forced them to, but because politics and power corrupted their vision.
And this inherent ambiguity forces you, as the viewer, into a constant state of moral repositioning. You're compelled to view every event from multiple conflicting perspectives.
Which is exactly the kind of intellectual exercise you get when you're studying complex periods of actual history.
And that connection to history is no accident at all. The world of Westeros is stitched together using extensive European historical inspirations. Martin didn't invent a new history, he borrowed the bloodiest parts of our own.
The most direct parallel, the one that really anchors the entire story, is the English Wars of the Roses. That was fought between 1455 and 1485.
Right. A brutal succession conflict between the houses of Lancaster and York. It provided the blueprint for the civil war that consumes the Seven Kingdoms.
And it's a very clear mapping. The powerful, manipulative, and slightly more centralized Lannisters reflecting the House of Lancaster.
And the northern, grounded, and often ill-fated Starks reflecting the House of York.
But the historical texture is so much wider than just that one war.
Oh, much wider. The Roman structure that inspired the famous northern boundary Hadrian's Wall in Roman Britain, that becomes Martin's enormous structure, the Wall, guarded by the Night's Watch.
We also see echoes of the fall of the Roman Empire and maybe the legend of Atlantis in the history of ancient Valyria, wiped out by that sudden catastrophe known as Doom.
The military and cultural inspirations are also pulled straight from world history. For example, the ferocious nomadic Mongol hordes who swept across Asia and Eastern Europe clearly inspired the Dothraki horsemen.
Especially their rapid conquest and their reliance on cavalry.
Exactly. And even the economic structures echo our past. Slaver's Bay across the Narrow Sea draws distinct parallels to aspects of ancient Egypt and the classical world, with its institutionalized slavery and complex trade routes.
And what about the weaponry? The almost mythical destructive power of wildfire.
That's a direct parallel to Byzantine Greek fire. It was a liquid chemical weapon whose composition was kept secret for centuries, and it was known for its ability to burn on water and cause total devastation.
So all of this historical grounding was intended to make the consequences of war feel real and immediate.
And this leads us to arguably the most shocking and effective storytelling mechanism in the early seasons: the ruthless concept of character mortality.
It was a conscious choice by Martin, and initially the showrunners, to adhere to a realistic depiction of violence.
Absolutely. If you're fighting a civil war where honor is secondary to ambition, then even the most beloved central characters must be vulnerable to sudden, violent death.
And that decision, killing off characters who would traditionally be safe, it created a tension that was unmatched on television at the time.
I remember the profound sense of shock it delivered. We were trained by decades of television that the star actor, the lead hero, was protected.
But Game of Thrones established very early on that if you make a mistake, if you trust the wrong person, or if you simply lose a battle, you are gone.
And the data actually supports that feeling of constant danger. A 2012 study looked at 40 major television dramas.
And it ranked Game of Thrones second overall in deaths per episode.
Second, averaging a staggering 14 deaths every single time an episode aired. It was a bloodbath, and intentionally so.
Further analysis confirms this wasn't just background characters either.
Right. A scientific study from 2018 confirmed that about 60% of the major identified characters they looked at had died as a direct result of violence or war during the first 7 seasons. The statistical probability of survival was just low.
But this high mortality rate didn't hold steady, did it?
No, it didn't. As the show progressed and surpassed Martin's published source material, critics noted a distinct shift. Certain characters, particularly those the audience was most invested in, began to survive increasingly unlikely, even impossible scenarios.
And that's where the term plot armor became so popularized in reference to the show.
It was a frustration for many fans who felt that original commitment to realism was being compromised. It was transforming the narrative from that gritty, unpredictable historical fiction feel into something more aligned with the traditional, predictable Hollywood action series.
So in many ways, the stakes felt lowered the safer the central characters became.
It was almost an acknowledgement that once the show became a truly global blockbuster, the pressure to maintain key performers and fan favorites for the long haul, well, it superseded the author's original vision for brutal, realistic consequences.
That tension between art and commerce is something we'll see repeated throughout the production story.
Exactly.
You mentioned commerce, and that brings us to our next crucial point. The sheer scale of the production, the budget, the logistics, the technical artistry, that's where the Game of Thrones phenomenon truly defines itself as a landmark industrial achievement.
It's incredible to trace its origins. The showrunners, David Benioff and D.V. Weiss, they pitched the series to HBO, but they had to overcome Martin's own skepticism. He'd already dismissed Hollywood offers, believing his novels were just unfilmable as a traditional feature film.
And his reasoning was sound. Martin pointed out that just one of his novels was comparable in length and scope to The Lord of the Rings.
Which required 3 massive feature films.
Exactly. So trying to compress that scale into a 2-hour movie would require gutting the narrative, removing characters, and simplifying all that complexity.
And crucially, Martin hated the constraints of feature film ratings. He understood that a major studio adaptation would likely require a PG-13 rating. His exact words on removing the explicit content, the sex, the blood, the profanity, were famously dismissive.
He knew those adult themes were central to the story's realism.
So HBO's long-form, uncensored series format was the perfect fit. It allowed them the time and the freedom to keep the complexity, the vast cast, and the adult content. Martin reportedly told the pitch team that he never imagined it anywhere else.
But bringing that vision to life was a financial undertaking that really tested the limits of television production. And the start was shaky, too.
Very shaky. The initial pilot episode was massively expensive, rumored to cost HBO between $5 and $10 million, and yet it was deemed largely unusable.
They had to execute a massive, extensive reshoot. Something like 90% of the original pilot was redone, including bringing in new directors and replacing some cast members.
That initial investment was a huge gamble, and the costs only escalated from there. While the entire first season budget was estimated at $50 to $60 million, we see HBO immediately recognizing the need to pump in more funds for key moments.
A perfect example is in Season 2. The network provided a 15% budget increase, specifically to accommodate the climactic siege battle in the episode Blackwater.
Which alone cost a staggering $8 million to produce. At the time, that single episode's cost rivaled that of a smaller feature film.
And that upward trend just became historic. By 2016, leading into the sixth season, the average budget had more than doubled from the early seasons. It was reaching over $10 million per episode.
Which pushed the seasonal total beyond $100 million, setting a new production cost record for a scripted series at that time.
And by the time they reached that shortened final season, the scale of the endeavor was simply unprecedented. The production budget was estimated to be a staggering $15 million per episode.
That level of spending used to define the summer blockbuster, not weekly television. It signaled a new era where television was competing directly with cinema in terms of sheer financial weight and scope.
To manage that kind of investment, you need an army of talent. And Game of Thrones famously earned the distinction of having the largest ensemble cast on television.
It was a global call for actors, many of whom were relative unknowns before the series.
And the massive size of the cast certainly translated into high wages as the show's popularity peaked.
Right. By the final season, reports indicated that 5 core cast members, the ones whose characters survived the longest and had the largest arcs, were each earning $1 million per episode,
making them some of the highest paid performers in global television.
But that investment paid off in terms of critical acclaim for the acting. While the ensemble was vast, certain performances became legendary. Peter Dinklage's portrayal of Tyrion Lannister was universally lauded.
He embodied the character as charming, morally ambiguous, and self-aware, often stealing scenes and providing that necessary dark humor and intellectual weight.
Dinklage's work was rewarded with multiple Emmy and Golden Globe awards, and critics frequently commented on his centrality. One suggested that, in many ways, Game of Thrones belongs to Dinklage. He managed to bring humanity to a world full of monsters.
And we also have to acknowledge the critical praise for the female leads who carried immense dramatic weight. People like Lena Headey as the chilling and complex Cersei Lannister, and Maisie Williams, whose transformation as Arya Stark resonated so deeply with viewers.
Her early seasons working alongside the veteran Charles Dance, who played Tywin Lannister, were often highlighted as masterclasses in subtle, intense acting.
Now, moving to the technical backbone of the show, the visual ambition never rested. It's the only way you can realize dragons and ice zombies and collapsing castles at that scale.
Over 10,000 individual visual effects shots were used across all 8 seasons.
Just think about that number for a second. 10,000 shots requiring highly specialized CGI work, far surpassing the average blockbuster film.
It meant employing major international VFX companies simultaneously, like Pixamondo and Macavision, just to handle the volume and complexity.
And their commitment to visual quality resulted in a historic run. The series won the Creative Arts Emmy for Outstanding Special Visual Effects in 7 consecutive seasons.
That's a consistency and domination that few series, even high-budget sci-fi, have ever achieved.
But it wasn't just digital smoke and mirrors. The physical craftsmanship was just as extensive.
Take the costume design, for instance. It was a massive undertaking involving intricate armor inspired by historical traditions ranging from Japanese samurai to Persian empires. The wildling's bone armor, for example, was actually molded from real bones to get an authentic look.
And we can't overlook the sheer wig budget. To achieve the specific looks of the Targaryens and various other houses, the show required creating about 24 highly expensive custom human wigs.
Some measuring up to 2 feet long and costing up to $7,000 each.
That attention to detail extended to the mundane, or what should have been mundane. The costume team had a specific, elaborate process for aging every single outfit.
All costumes had to be deliberately scuffed, stained, and weathered for 2 full weeks before they were even allowed on set.
2 weeks of aging for clothes. Why?
Because they were shooting in high definition on enormous budgets, and a brand new, clean garment would immediately look cheap and fake on screen. The clothing needed to look like it had endured the mud, the cold, and the grime of a real medieval world. That required intense, dedicated physical craft.
And then there's the linguistic complexity. George R. R. Martin gave us hints of Dothraki and Valyrian in the novels, maybe a dozen words in total.
But the production hired professional conlanger David J. Peterson to construct these unique languages from the ground up.
Peterson is a linguist who specializes in constructed languages, and his task was monumental.
He had to develop complete grammatical structures, syntax, comprehensive vocabulary. He reportedly created 300 pages of Dothraki language material alone, transforming a few fictional words into functional, speakable languages that actors could actually learn.
Which just further solidified that immersive realism that Martin originally sought. This wasn't just fantasy, it was meticulous world building. When you have a production of this magnitude, which operates globally and invests $15 million per episode, the economic impact on the real-world locations that stand in for Westeros, it becomes measurable and lasting.
That's right. The show didn't just film on sound stages. It was a traveling circus that redefined the visual identity of the fantasy genre by using stunning, diverse, and remote locations.
The production schedule was extensive and international, requiring parallel filming units.
Sometimes running 3 different crews simultaneously in 3 different countries.
Northern Ireland was the undeniable production hub. It served as the main base at Paint Hall Studios and provided that gritty northern feel of Westeros.
Locations like Castle Ward stood in for Winterfell, and the Magirramorn quarry was famously transformed into the frigid outpost of Castle Black.
But the sunnier, more decadent south required warmer climates.
Right. They initially used Malta for King's Landing, particularly the city of Medina. However, starting with Season 2, the filming for the capital city permanently shifted to Croatia. The stunning walled city of Dubrovnik became instantly recognizable as King's Landing.
And to capture the world beyond the Civil War, they had to go to extremes.
Iceland was absolutely crucial for capturing that fierce, smindy aesthetic used for all the scenes north the wall. It provided the dramatic frozen landscapes that defined the threat of the White Walkers.
Beyond these main hubs, the global footprint extended to Spain, which provided many of the southern Dornish settings.
And Morocco for certain scenes across the Narrow Sea and Essos, particularly the Slavers Bay cities, and even some locations in Canada.
This global presence created what is widely known now as the Game of Thrones effect, a massive, quantifiable tourism and economic boom in all these filming regions.
Take Northern Ireland, the primary production base. The series acted as a significant industrial catalyst. It heavily boosted creative industries, contributing to an estimated 12.4% growth in related arts and entertainment jobs between 2008 and 2013 alone.
That's a powerful economic stimulus driven entirely by fictional storytelling.
The tourism numbers are astounding. By 2019, Northern Ireland reported that 350,000 visitors annually, roughly 1/6 of all tourists, were motivated to visit specifically because of the show.
And the legacy was so strong that HBO later invested in converting several key filming locations into permanent, profitable tourist attractions.
The effect was not confined to the UK. Hotels.com documented dramatic increases in tourism in the specific filming locations globally. Iceland, already popular, saw bookings surge by 285% between 2014 and 2016.
Dubrovnik experienced a 120% increase in bookings during that same period.
Even Ouarzazate, Morocco, saw its hotel bookings double, thanks to its role as a setting for Daenerys' armies.
However, this wild success introduced a complex real-world challenge: the double-edged sword of over-tourism.
In Dubrovnik, the local government estimated that the influx of visitors attributed to the show accounted for about half of the city's annual increase in overnight stays over several years.
And while that's economically beneficial, this sudden, massive influx strained infrastructure and altered the character of the ancient city.
In response, Dubrovnik's mayor ultimately had to impose limits on the number of tourists allowed within the ancient walls at any given time. This demonstrates the immense, tangible power the show had. It required cities to physically manage the crowds it generated.
Even after the series concluded, the economic legacy continues. The sheer volume of licensed merchandise, from replica swords to brewery collaborations.
And the ubiquity of Funko dolls, it generated billions.
And that financial interest continues even today. In 2024, HBO partnered with Heritage Auctions for an immense event that auctioned off over 2,000 screen-used items.
This included major iconic props like Jon Snow's sword and most famously one of the physical Iron Throne props. The demand for these tangible pieces of the phenomenon just underscores its enduring economic value.
While the production story is one of unprecedented success, the cultural conversation around Game of Thrones was often fraught and intense, particularly concerning its depiction of sensitive topics. And we must address this with the necessary detail and sensitivity.
Yes. Despite the high overall critical praise, it maintained an overall rating of 89% on Rotten Tomatoes. The series' relentless use of extreme violence and sexual violence generated continuous, sharp criticism.
To frame this discussion, we should revisit the author's original intent. George R. Martin's defense of this content was rooted in his core philosophy of historical realism.
Right. He argued that he felt obligated to be truthful about history and human nature, maintaining the acts of extreme violence, including sexual violence, are tragically common in war and feudal conflict. In his view, omitting them would make the world feel false.
However, critics often argue that the way the violence was depicted was where the show crossed the line from realism into exploitation.
For instance, early on, critics coined the term sexposition. This describes the practice of delivering crucial plot information, or exposition, while simultaneously accompanying it with nudity or sex.
This was heavily criticized as a cheap narrative device. Commentators argued that the nudity was frequently distracting and often served primarily to cater to the male gaze, rather than serving a legitimate narrative purpose.
Beyond the general issue of sexposition, specific narrative choices made during the adaptation generated widespread public outrage, especially when the show deviated from the source material.
The first major instance was in the premiere season, concerning the marriage of Daenerys Targaryen and Khal Drogo. In the book, the relationship, while transactional, begins with clear consent.
But the showrunners chose to dramatically change this. The adaptation portrayed the scene explicitly as sexual violence. This change was cited by many critics as an act of exploitation for shock value. They argued it fundamentally altered Daenerys' introduction and character arc in an unnecessarily brutal way.
Later seasons continued to introduce disturbing, graphically depicted trauma. We saw the lengthy, agonizing torture and eventual emasculation of Theon Greyjoy by Ramsay Bolton.
That section of the storyline was so visually intense that critics often labeled it torture porn. It is worth noting, however, that it was highlighted as one of the very few instances in the series involving a male victim of sexual assault.
Another deeply controversial moment occurred in Season 4, involving Jaime and Cersei Lannister in the Sept, next to the body of their deceased son. This scene, depicting Jaime raping his sister, triggered a massive public discussion.
The controversy was further fueled when the episode's director suggested in subsequent comments that the scene had devolved into something consensual by the end, a statement that was immediately and severely criticized.
The criticism culminated in what many consider the nadir of the series, the widely condemned rape of Sansa Stark by Ramsay Bolton in the Season 5 episode, Unbowed, Unbent, Unbroken.
This incident caused intense backlash because, unlike much of the earlier violence which had roots in the source material, this violation was a complete invention of the showrunners, a decision to inflict new, unique trauma upon a beloved character.
The emotional response was palpable and immediate. That episode received the lowest Rotten Tomatoes rating for the entire series up to that point.
Yeah.
It also caused significant real-world fallout.
The popular culture website, The Mary Sue, publicly announced it would cease all future coverage of the series due to the perceived repeated unnecessary use of rape as a gratuitous plot device. It is essential to express sympathy for any victim of such depicted brutality and acknowledge the distress these scenes caused for many viewers.
And for the actors involved as well. Sophie Turner, who played Sansa, later spoke about the need to develop strong coping mechanisms while filming such heavy scenes from a young age.
The narrative's handling of gender and power remained a point of deep academic and critical discussion. Some scholars propose that the series could be interpreted as a long-arc revenge fantasy,
focusing on women who were initially brutalized, like Daenerys, Sansa, and even Cersei, who then managed to climb the political ladder to gain immense power.
But that interpretation was strongly challenged by the narrative choices in the later seasons. Critics widely argued that the final season poorly handled the resolution of these powerful female character storylines,
suggesting their agency and development were sacrificed for the sake of abrupt plot expediency.
Now, moving to a drastically different but equally persistent critique, we have to discuss the technical issue of the lighting debate.
This was the recurring complaint about the pronounced lack of light in darker scenes, a problem that began drawing attention around Season 6. Viewers regularly flooded social media, complaining they couldn't distinguish characters or actions.
The frustration peaked during the massive Season 8 battle episode, The Long Night. Viewers watching at home took to social media and forums to complain that they had severe difficulties seeing the action on their typical television screens.
The show's cinematographer, in defense of the artistic choice, explained that the darkness was entirely intentional. It was designed to be naturalistic, aiming for a look that avoided the artificial brightness of many television night scenes.
But the audience argument was essentially a conflict between artistic vision and practical technology. Critics and viewers pointed out that the aesthetic, which might have worked on a perfectly calibrated, high-contrast, large-screen movie theater setup, completely failed to translate to the average consumer's smaller, often brightly lit television screen at home.
Leading to a blurry, frustrating viewing experience. It raised questions about whether production quality was serving the viewer or only the artistic ego.
Right.
Looking beyond the technical and content controversies, the lasting legacy of Game of Thrones is how thoroughly it integrated itself into popular culture, academia, and even scientific taxonomy.
Its primary impact is structural. The show is widely credited with fundamentally shifting the commercial acceptability and popularity of the fantasy genre. Its willingness to invest massive budgets and attract A-list talent made big-budget fantasy television a reality.
Its success essentially paved the way for the prestige fantasy series that followed. Networks recognized the immense, untapped global market, leading directly to the greenlighting and huge investment in projects like Amazon's The Lord of the Rings, The Rings of Power.
Before Game of Thrones, a $100 million per season fantasy show was unthinkable. After it, it became the benchmark.
The fervor generated an unparalleled fandom. In 2012, Vulture magazine ranks the series' fans as the most devoted in popular culture, surpassing the dedication shown to even giants like Harry Potter or Star Wars.
And this devotion transcended traditional entertainment circles, crossing into the highest echelons of global politics. The international fan base famously include prominent leaders like former American President Barack Obama,
who received advance copies of episodes,
and former British Prime Minister David Cameron and former Australian Prime Minister Julia Gillard also publicly declared their enthusiasm.
The cultural influence saturated daily language and learning. We already discussed the term sexposition entering the common lexicon.
But the fully constructed Dothraki language became popular enough to be the focus of a widely used Duolingo course, seeing 1.2 million signups between 2017 and 2020.
And one of the most unique and lasting forms of cultural absorption is through naming conventions, even though Khaleesi is explicitly only a title in Dothraki.
Meaning warlord's wife, yes.
It became a strikingly popular name for baby girls in the United States, alongside the more conventional but equally popular character name, Arya.
The show's depth and complexity also made it an instant target for serious academic and scientific inquiry across remarkably diverse fields. It moved far beyond simple pop culture discussion.
For instance, the Mathematical Association of America published a journal where researchers applied network science to map the complex relationships between the 330 major characters.
So they could analyze the social structure and centrality of power within Westeros as a genuine mathematical model.
Australian scientists performed a detailed survival analysis on those same 330 characters, approaching the fictional world as a genuine dataset to study mortality rates.
And in an even more unusual application, the Australian Red Cross utilized international humanitarian law to analyze events and determine which characters committed the most serious war crimes during the first 7 seasons.
We can't discuss the scientific legacy without mentioning the biological taxonomy. The show's influence stretched so far that new animal species have been officially named after elements of the series.
The list is surprisingly extensive. It includes 3 species of tiny, newly classified mud dragons, named Echinoderus denerasa, Echinoderus regal, and Echinoderus dragoni.
A type of bee fly was named Paramenovius night king after the imposing leader of the White Walkers.
And 3 different species of scarab beetles were given the names of Daenerys' dragons: Gymnetus dragoni, Gymnetus regali, and Gymnetus viseriani.
It seems the scientific community has a deep affinity for the Targaryen bloodline.
And that biological naming tradition even extended to the author himself. A brittle star, a type of marine invertebrate, was named Ophiohamus George Martini because its sharp, spiny thorns strongly resembled the metal structure of the crown in the series.
Finally, the animal connection continues into the present day. As recently as 2025, the biotechnology firm Colossal Biosciences announced significant progress in its highly ambitious de-extinction project, focusing on bringing back the dire wolf.
The symbol of the Stark family. And this project has a direct link back to the show. George R. Martin himself is an investor in the company.
And the first three de-extincted wolves were named Romulus, Remus, and, fittingly, Khaleesi.
It's a powerful illustration of how the mythology of Westeros has transcended fiction to be cemented in name and concept within actual biological science.
The conclusion of the main narrative arc in 2019 was never going to be the end of the world of Westeros for HBO. They immediately recognized the franchise's value.
Yes, initially, HBO greenlit 5 individual successor concepts focusing on different periods and families within the world's history.
Yeah.
It's a massive logistical challenge to maintain quality.
And not everything made it. One of the earliest prequel attempts, set thousands of years before the main story, was commissioned for a full pilot, complete with a high-profile cast, but it was ultimately shelved.
But 2 key projects did move forward, ensuring the franchise legacy continues strongly. The most successful so far is House of the Dragon, which premiered in 2022. It's based on Martin's historical text, Fire and Blood.
The success of that show has ensured the franchise is stable and expanding. Another prequel is already scheduled, titled A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, expected in 2026.
And that one is based on Martin's beloved Tales of Dunk and Egg novellas, offering a more intimate look at earlier adventures in Westeros.
We also see continued investment in other diverse concepts. An animated series in development, The Golden Empire, set in the far eastern nation of Yi.
And there's also continued work on a series centered around Aegon's conquest, which united the Seven Kingdoms.
It's interesting to note that even a direct sequel focusing on Jon Snow, which was championed by actor Kit Harington, was reportedly shelved after initial development.
The reason cited was that despite the actor's passion, the creative team simply couldn't find a story that was exciting enough or justified the immense expense of another series.
It confirms that even with the biggest names attached, HBO is prioritizing quality and narrative potential over guaranteed fan service.
The appetite for this world remains immense, but the network is clearly being selective.
If we look back at this whole incredible epic, the sheer magnitude of the series is what ultimately defines its place in history. It began as dense, niche fantasy literature that its own author deemed unfilmable.
And yet it was transformed into a dominant cultural and economic force. It redefined what we expect from serialized storytelling, moving from a TV show to dictating everything from tourism policy to scientific taxonomy.
That's the real point here. The fact that HBO took on George R. Martin's vision, a vision requiring immense financial backing, global logistics, the invention of languages, and successfully realized it on screen, is a remarkable story.
It established a new ceiling for what television ambition could achieve.
And it raises an important question for you to consider. If Game of Thrones proved that this kind of dense, detailed literary world, one deemed too sprawling for the screen, could be adapted with such unprecedented effort, what other seemingly unadaptable literary worlds are just waiting for their own transformative television moment?
Thanks for listening.